Guys, welcome back to another episode of the Everyday Warrior podcast. I'm with Anu Gupta, who just wrote the book Breaking Bias, Where Stereotypes and Prejudices Come From, and the Science-Backed Method to Unravel Them. Let's jump in with this. And I do want to get your background and give people a better understanding of where you came from. What is the difference between bias and stereotypes?
Yeah, we'll jump right in. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So basically, bias is what results from stereotypes. Stereotypes are false stories that we have about people based purely on their being, whether it's their color, their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their beliefs. But bias is what happens when we believe those stereotypes in terms of the decision making we make. So the way I define bias is that it's a learned habit that distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. And there are two forms of biases. There are conscious biases. So these are learned false beliefs. Something as simple as, men make better leaders than women. It's a false belief, right? But many people believe it. So it's a conscious bias. And then
just to stop you there, actually, female-led boards are financially more prudent than
that's true.
Boards.
That's
just
true.
To back your point, but go ahead.
That's true. And then unconscious biases are, false habits of thoughts. These are false associations that we have that distort, once again, how we perceive and make decisions. So for me, this is what I really want to get, drill down into, because a lot of times we think that we're born with biases. There's a misconception widespread in our society, but having done the research around the neuroscience and social psychology of it, we've learned that biases are learned, and just as they're learned, they can be unlearned. And for me, that's what the opportunity is. This idea that our brains are completely plastic, neuroplasticity has been proven time and time again. So for me, it's really to bring this into the zeitgeist so we can feel a sense of belonging within our own being, but also in the communities we live, the families we live in, and of course, our society as a whole.
Social media. That people still cling to the nature versus nurture argument.
Yeah.
Blows my mind.
Yeah.
There was actually a great documentary where they split up three twins. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I've seen it.
Yeah. And it shows how each of them became a completely different person based off the environment they grew up in. That's insane. I'm sure there are some things with regards to nature that somebody's built or just born with innate levels of intelligence or physical ability given their DNA. But
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So where are you from? I know you said you were born and raised in India.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Moved here when you were 10.
Yes.
Do you remember India? Well, I mean, you were 10, so you must have a vivid memory of what it was like there.
Very much so. I talk a lot about it in my book also. I grew up in this really old part of Delhi. So it's a really ancient city. It's known as Old Delhi, Chandni Chowk. And basically there are fortresses standing there that are 800 years old, and people are just walking in and out of it. I lived in an environment that was incredibly diverse, religiously diverse, and of course, politically diverse. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, you name it, right? Jews, Parsis. So I was born with an idea oh my God, human beings exist in so many different forms, of course, all genders, poverty, sheer amount of poverty. So pretty early, I was exposed to human difference, but I was also really curious as to why people are different. What does that mean? And, as most kids are, I was just humans are humans, so I was very used to, people's differences, different languages that they spoke, different ways they dressed their bodies. But when I moved to the US, suddenly I became the different one. And that's where I think my journey around bias and breaking bias really began. So when I was 10 years old, the first question my mom was asked when she enrolled me into school was, the race question, what's your child's race? And she had three options, black, white, and other. So she was like, Indian isn't here. So the administrator was like, well, you're neither black nor white, so let's check off the other box. And that kind of really introduced me into the zeitgeist of the challenges we have as Americans now, and also as a global society, around these false ideas of notions of race and ethnicity. And for me, that really meant that I was another, because my classmates had ideas of me, particularly because I was from India. A lot of people had watched the film Temple of the Doom. I don't know if you remember that Indiana Jones movie.
Of course.
So my classmates would tell me that, oh, you eat monkey brains. And I was like, no. All the time I'd be teased for eating monkey brains, even though my family was vegetarian. And they worshipped monkeys, right? If you think about the god Hanuman.
Yes.
But it's,
so of the Hindu faith?
The Hindu faith, okay. Yeah. So it was different for them. But you can't really, fact check your bullies, right? But there was one thing that got me, that was really interesting as I was bullied was I was being called gay a lot. Like, you're so gay, you're gay, you're gay. And, I let it go for like 2 years. But like, I think towards the end of my 7th grade, I was like, why are you guys picking on me for being happy? Like, I just like to be happy. I was raised in India, British English, I thought being gay was being happy and cheerful, which I was.
To explain for the audience, if you don't know, British use that word to mean happy.
Yeah. And then like one of my bullies like looked me straight in the eyes, like, and I probably think he had some pity for me, right? He was like, why don't you go home today and like look up this word in the dictionary? So I did. And what I found out was same-sex loving people. And for a second, I was like, oh my gosh, there is a word for what I feel inside. But then immediately I was like, wait, people sensing that this is who I am is why I'm being so like brutally bullied. So like for me, that's when the journey of like kind of going into the closet and not revealing who I am really began. And then I basically since then really watched the way I walked, the way I talked, the intonations of my voice, the inflections, the depth of my tone, because I never wanted to be associated with being gay or being like a woman, right? And that, again, took a huge toll on me, outside of the bullying around my ethnic background. Sexuality was a huge thing. And I basically compressed all of that within myself.
Give me a time test. Is this the 90s, the 2000s?
Mid-90s, yeah.
The 90s, okay. So it's still...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like early days, right? Pre-being gay. It's like towards the end of the...
Don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, towards the end of the HIV/AIDS crisis. Yeah. We're still coming out of that. So I didn't know anything about these larger issues at the time. I was like this innocent, immigrant kid. But I was always very curious, about cultures, about geography. I just loved it. So, even in high school, I won various science competitions because that's what I thought like I needed to do. I need to just get all A's all the time and get a lot of scholarships and make it professionally, which I did, right? Went to NYU, I was pre-med, excelled at that. But then I was really curious about cultures. So I moved to international relations and Islamic studies actually, because after 9/11, I lived in New York City. I would just have people like call me terrorist or Osama bin Laden, like strangers on the subway, like in elevators. I had this one guy do this. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm not Muslim, but even if I was, like, not every 1.3 billion Muslims in the world are terrorists. But I would just face that over and over again. So I was like, wait, why do people hate Muslims so much? So I turned my studies into really understanding the religion. I was actually funded by the Department of Defense. They had a program of language learning called the National Security Education Program. So they basically funded my major in Islamic studies. I went back to India for the first time, studied Urdu there, studied Islam there, lived in Muslim communities, really got to know them. And I was like, wait, they profess the same exact principles of love, compassion, generosity, forgiveness that every other faith tradition does. So, but, that's where like my curiosity around this stuff began. But, after that, I worked internationally, was really curious about human rights and economic development, worked in Myanmar and Malaysia and other places. Yeah, authoritarian country, 100%, Orwellian country. If you read 1984.
How old were you when you went to Myanmar?
I was 21. Started a nonprofit there, had a school.
Brutal?
Yeah, I mean, basically I would travel around the country and I would see the same people everywhere. And at first I was like, maybe I'm just like making it up. No, they were the same people, sometimes wearing the same shirt, same clothing, because they were following me around. I had an American passport, so they knew that I had entered. They wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing anything, no funny business, right? Because a lot of Americans actually were imprisoned there for trying to spread democratic ideas. And for me, because I was so inspired by their leader, who's still under house arrest, Aung San Suu Kyi, I was like, well, we can't just like put embargoes on these countries because the people inside are suffering. Because the military junta there is still getting funded by China and Russia and other places. But the poor people of this country are suffering. So I wanted to go in and really understand and help in an apolitical way. So for me, like the middle path has always been the way I like do things, because that's just who I am, my constitution. And that work led me to like getting a master's in international development. I went to Cambridge in the UK, and it was at Cambridge. I was like, oh my gosh, I really want to pursue like this work. But one of my professors actually, he was my advisor, Ha-Joon Chang. He's a heterodox economist. And he was like, you're too much of an advocate to become an academic, you're going to suffer so much because you actually want to create change. You don't want to just study these problems and write papers about it. So he basically recommended that I go to law school back in my country, in the US. So I applied, I got into NYU Law.
So hold on. NYU pre-med,
Yeah.
go and get your master's in international
Relations, yeah.
relations. But at NYU, you started taking classes outside of pre-med,
Yeah.
sociology,
Gender
international
studies,
relations,
international relations.
and PhD, I'm sorry, and you got your JD.
Yeah. Afterwards, yeah, in 2011.
Underachiever, man.
Underachiever, right?
That's it?
It was basically I'd bought into that, you have to keep on achieving in order to really succeed and feel successful and then be happy, right?
Well, talking about biases, is that also a family-driven thing? Because
Yeah.
where my was so highly impressed
Sure.
with the MBA students at the University of Texas that worked for India.
Yeah.
I've never seen a harder working culture.
That's right.
People think of, like, you talk to Europeans, they're like, Americans work too hard. I
Robots.
got along with all of them.
Yeah.
I think because I had a military background,
Sure.
they were just all business. But that is again, this is a bias, a very cultural thing too.
Yeah.
No?
I wouldn't say in my family, actually.
No.
So like my parents never really cared about how, as long as I was happy and I did well, they were okay with it. It was really like inside of me that was really different. Of course, they wanted me to succeed and get a job and make a lot of money, and as most parents do. But in terms of my professional choice, they've always been quite supportive. But I think for me, it was really about learning the American ways that, if you succeed, if you make a lot of money, if you have these titles, if you have, all these accolades, that's how you earn respect.
You're more worldly than I am. Is that a very American thing?
Being worldly.
No. Just the titles, the education,
I think so, actually. I believe so. It's really something that I think as Americans, not everyone, but a lot of us, seek external validation to give us a sense of purpose within. But having worked in different places like Myanmar and I taught English in South Korea and Taiwan and Morocco and other places, I feel like a lot of people are just content. Like that word contentment gets thrown around a lot, but they're just content with the way things are. They're really content with their families. They're content with their position in life. And of course, there are people, exceptions to the rule there too, that are super driven. But it's not in the zeitgeist, And I think it's part of the entrepreneurial nature of our country.
Yeah.
Right. That's how we were started, even in the 1600s, that's why the pioneers had come here, right? To really innovate and be entrepreneurial in that way. And I think that's why a lot of immigrants come here. I know that my parents came here for that reason. They're both doctors and they had a successful nursing home in India. They made bank, right? So they need to come to the US to do that. But it was really they bought into the American dream, right? And that they felt like there wasn't going to be as much red tape as they had experienced in India. So that's why a lot of immigrants come here. And then that's how our country was built, actually.
The land of opportunity.
Yeah.
You say pioneers, a lot of them tried to escape feudalism of some sort.
Sure.
Without red tape to change their station in life.
Yeah.
But then you get into what point is, we just talked about Isra Nasir, who has a book coming out called Toxic Productivity. To what point does that lead to a higher mental health state within America versus you look at other countries where mental health is not. Yeah.
Huge. Well, so in terms of my story, right? So in 2009, I was about to start my second year of law school. And the first year, I'd done relatively okay, but I was just feeling really sad having left Cambridge, coming back to this pressure cooker environment. And we were studying law, right? We were studying crim law, civil procedure, and a lot of our history is deeply tied to bias, right? Whether it's racism or sexism and other forms of, atrocities that were committed, until the civil rights era, where we began to have massive changes in our society. But there was no room to actually talk about personal experiences of bias, which is how, because I'd had so many. Particularly with homophobia, with racism, with Islamophobia. So I began to actually believe the stories, because when I would share oh, this happened to me, people were like, you're just making it up. You're being overly emotional. This is not rational. You need to be rational and stop sharing your feelings. And so I started believing that what I was feeling was wrong. And,
that it's weak.
That it was weak. And I just couldn't contain it. I was massively depressed, hyper, anxious. And then I think a couple of days before my second year was going to start, I found myself on the ledge of my 18th floor window about to jump off. Literally, like I was at that moment, I was like the dark night of the soul was there. And as I'm standing there looking at the Midtown Manhattan traffic below me, I started kind of hearing all the things I heard growing up, fat-nosed idiot, Hindu, like, Arab terrorist, you name it. And there was like a space between these stories and who I was. And then something really interesting happened. Instead of falling forward, because I did jump, I fell back into my apartment. And immediately I was like, oh my gosh. And I called someone, a friend of mine, who lived several miles away, but she happened to be walking on my block. And she showed up in my apartment within like 5 minutes. She stayed with me the entire night. And the next day I really began my breaking bias journey. And for me, the breaking bias journey was really about breaking through these false stories I had learned about myself for various identities that I hold, right? The self-loathing, the depression, and wanting to be something other than who I was. And that journey really took me, of course, through a lot of different healing modalities that I talk about in the book, to also understanding that this is really the core issue that we face as a global human society. Like bias is the root cause of every single challenge we face in business, in AI and technology that's coming up, within families, within our politics, challenges around climate change. So it was like, wow, this is really the building block of disagreements and, the polarization we're experiencing. And all of it is learned. And for me, it's like, this is where the opportunity is, that breaking bias really offers us an opportunity to shift consciousness.
You gonna take a swing at the media?
Yes, it's one of the 5 causes of bias.
You talk about, you touched on cognitive and, was it uncognitive? Or,
Yeah.
Okay, two forms of biases, but in the book you talk about the 4 forms.
Yeah.
Can you list those out and sort of explain them for me?
Absolutely, yeah. So bias, like the way it operates in our brains, it's either conscious or unconscious, but the way it manifests in our society is 4 forms, like you said. Internalized bias. So that's what I'd experienced, these false stories that I believed about myself. Then there's interpersonal bias, which is what most people understand bias as, you call me this, you call me that. So these are interpersonal interactions. Then there are institutional biases. And oftentimes you think of institutions as these like sterile, empty buildings, but institutions are actually made up of people. And institutional biases are shared perceptions of people that make decisions or have a lot of influence, that become policies and then impact many, many people. So if you think about, in our country, when segregation was passed, it was a shared perception of the lawmakers, right? And it was institutionalized that, women couldn't go to college, or Black people had to live separately from white people. Even this idea of what whiteness means, right? So this was shared perceptions. And then there are systemic biases, which is kind of the ultra level, where shared kind of perceptions within institutions become systemic, right, across the board. So that's like the impact of these disparities. But that manifests as disparity, whether it's in healthcare or criminal justice or employment. And for me, like, if you think about the building block at the very micro level, it really starts in our hearts, in our hearts and minds. And that's where I was like, oh, wow, this is the work of really shifting consciousness in this century.
Let me ask you this. So, 9/11, which I don't know why anyone would confuse you with being Muslim.
Yeah.
I got to tell this story. I had just gotten back from Iraq in 2010.
Gosh.
We were one of the, 2014. We were one of the first in for the ISIS thing.
Wow.
And when I came back, my sister was going to an Ole Miss, which I believe is Oxford, Mississippi, Ole Miss University. I think so. Katy Perry sang the national anthem.
Oh, that's
so
right.
We went out and drank afterwards, and I'm sort of in a bad mood because when I get back from deployment, I'll just be in a bad mood. And I go to the bathroom, and there's some Indian students, clearly from India, foreign exchange students, in the bar, and there's the typical white country Southerner that is just calling the guy Muslim and making the 9/11 jokes, and I'm just like, don't get involved. So I'll just murder this guy.
No.
And eventually he just went too far. And I'm like, hey man, if you can't fucking tell, you idiot, they're from India. They're not Muslim.
Yeah.
They're not from a Muslim country. And if you don't shut up, I basically threatened the guy, and the guy shut up. But how can, it's very human after 9/11 for a lot of Americans to form a bias towards
Yeah.
Muslims.
Yeah.
I mean, it's human nature.
Yeah.
How can you? I mean, how can we break that cycle? Which I think that's you're behind an eight ball in that one, in my opinion. I mean, how would you approach that one? I mean, after losing 3,000 Americans
Yeah.
by a very small microcosm, a percentage of Islamic
Right.
extremists.
Right.
I mean, how do you break that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex question. Well, first of all, thank you for your service and for, your
Thanks for paying for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, with your tax dollars. It was awesome.
I mean, I wouldn't wish it. I was opposed to the war. I'm as you can imagine, I'm pro peace always.
War is stupid. I'm not advocating for that. However,
Yeah.
you've heard this quote, and I believe it was John Stuart Mill. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to stand by and do nothing.
Amen.
And
Amen.
War is human nature.
Yeah.
As long as the evil exists and somebody's going to pray or kill or massacre or
That's
engage in
right.
genocide,
That's right.
that is the byproduct of it. And I hate it. I would never want to see my son or daughters go to war.
Yeah.
But we all hold your belief in that one, and we always used to say what warriors truly are trained in the art of war, but in the profession of peace.
I agree. That's really my goal and aspiration in this life, for more people to be trained in that. But to your question, there's a couple of things I want to a couple of strands I want to pick up on. Well, so for me, like, one thing I'll say is that when it comes to what happened in 9/11, like you said, a small group of extremists in the Middle East that committed that heinous crime. I was in New York City. I was in high school at the time. I was in southern Brooklyn. I went to high school in Brooklyn and basically saw the smoke for 2 months after, like crying every day, like couldn't go through Manhattan.
So you were in the classroom when it happened?
Yeah, we watched the whole thing. It was.
Did you go outside?
Of course, and we could see it, and we were all like, we couldn't call our parents. Like, it was just a frantic situation, right? But one thing I'll say is, because I have studied Islamic studies, I've lived in Islamic communities, and the vast majority of victims of Islamic terrorism and extremism are Muslims.
Yeah.
The vast majority of them, right? Their own brothers and sisters, mothers, so this is really human nature, right? Ultimately. So we have to overcome this idea of separation, that Muslims are different from us. They actually are us. This happens in every society with every form of extremism, whether it's Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever else. So I think that's something we have to remember. But the reason why we forget that, right, is because of our training and bias, right? So in the book, I talk about, for every kind of bias, there are 5 causes, whether it's racial bias or religious bias or gender bias, sexuality bias, you name it. And it starts with a false story, a story of a human hierarchy, which is like, this type of human is better than this other type of humans. And that hierarchy gets then implemented into policy, right, within a country or within a society, within a family even. Like, oftentimes, there's so many families.
Give me an example of policy.
Yeah, like, Jim Crow, for example.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? Easy breezy. Or the fact that certain kids, women couldn't go to college or couldn't get employed in certain places. It's still true. Women can't drive in certain countries to this day.
Yes.
It's a policy, right? Based purely on the anatomy of a human being. They can't change that, right? They can't change the fact that they're XX chromosomes, right? And yet that's what happens. But then how do we get trained in bias based on that container of false story and policies? Is the latter 3 things. Social contact, which is basically, people who we trust, our trusted spheres of influence, our teachers, our parents, our family members, our rabbis, our ministers, education or miseducation oftentimes, within our classrooms, or a massive information gap where we're not taught about, for example, in this example, Muslims. Like, I didn't grow up seeing any brown people, like, in any of my textbooks when I was in America, right? There was nothing about India that I learned. I learned about, little things here and there. So a lot of us aren't taught. So there's an information gap that can then be filled in by the 5th cause of bias, which is media. And oftentimes, the way media has worked, traditionally in our country is, it's basically triggering our fear brain, because that's how they engage our attention. And basically, stories that are lies, particularly that are laced with anger and hatred, spread faster than truths. And
because you're tapping into human emotions.
And if you tell a lie enough times, 100 times, it becomes the truth.
Yes.
That's the big lie. That's what the Nazis had done. And it's basically a playbook, right? And that's what a lot of times media has done. And, of course, there's responsible media out there as well, but then it's connected to,
I'm almost pushed to ask you which ones are responsible.
Yeah.
But we'll skip that.
yeah, but I mean, with that said, I think ultimately, even nowadays, though, it's just all about triggering that fear brain and hating the other. And that's how that person that you saw in the bar, right, who said those awful things about those Indian students, I think about that human being. He has the same nervous system as I do, as you do, right? But how was this training? What was the false story? Which container did he grow up in when it comes to policies? But then what did his family, people that he loved, say about Muslims, right? What was he educated about in school? And then the media he watched, right? So that's how he got hyper worked up in his own nervous systems. And for me, like, understanding that was really helpful because it allowed me to have empathy and compassion for everyone, even people that I disagree with, people that I have a hard time even being around, toxic personalities, talking about toxic productivity, right? And that's what we need to begin to do. And I feel like this is why it's so important to understand these 5 causes of bias, particularly for folks who have authority, who have influence over those social contact, over education, over media, to begin to shift, because our brains are plastic. And just as we can share negative news and negative information, we can also share positive news and correct misinformation and bridge the information gap and really cultivate empathy. And that's and in my research, I learned that a lot of societies have done that successfully. Like New Zealand is an example after the terrible mosque shooting that took place there, where, over 50 innocent, worshipers were just killed by someone, a white supremacist shooter. But the country was mourning with them, right? So it's a real great display of empathy and compassion, and those human beings now feel like they belong in that country. But everyone else also feels like, oh, like they're our neighbors, and we stand up with them. So that nuance can be taught.
Again, I lean on my experiences, but you would talk to World War II vets, especially not specifically those that fought in the European theater, but those that fought against the Japanese.
Yeah.
And they viewed all Japanese as evil, given what they saw on the battlefield. But given my experiences, if I look back, I probably stepped into Iraq, which was my first tour, with hate for all Muslims, because that's what conditioned and believed 9/11. I mean,
5 causes.
But you slowly saw, as you met more and more Iraqis, these people want the same thing: peace, prosperity for their families, similar to what we want. And I will say a good display of breaking that bias is you saw what a lot of private Americans did to get as many Afghanis out of
That's right.
Afghanistan during the withdrawal.
That's right.
I mean, you had American citizens that were no longer in the military chartering
That's right.
C-17s to go pull out as many as possible.
That's right.
But I know you worked with DoD, CIA. They recognized really early on that that bias went 2 ways: not only Americans towards Muslims, but Muslims towards Americans.
Yeah.
And that we were failing to educate the next generation to remove hate from their heart or stereotypes of what Americans are and what they stand for, and find that common ground. Yeah. They were wildly unsuccessful.
Right.
And they were using social media and every platform they could. On a global scale, I mean, you got to believe that social media is a tool that can be influential in breaking those biases.
Absolutely.
Though it's also a wild variable you can't control.
Yeah. I think it's both, and it's basically a tool, right? It's a platform, it's agnostic, but it's really about how it's used. Now, the challenge with social media in the last 10 years has been these algorithms that have put people into their echo chambers. So based on, knowing, these algorithms know what makes us stay on these platforms longer, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or LinkedIn. So as a result, they'll feed you that content. So it's basically what's known as confirmation bias. So it's giving you what you already believe, and it's strengthening those biases as opposed to breaking them. If there was an ulterior motive, the motive is around the profit, the profit motive. But if they really wanted to break biases, they would actually show people, who don't share that view and humanize them. And that is still possible, but we have to seek it out. right? So this is where kind of how do we break bias? There are 5 tools that help us break bias. That's where that comes in. And that's what I had to do actually, in breaking a lot of my own biases and, overcoming, this divide that I feel oftentimes, around the other, like the oppressor, that, and who oppressed me, whatever that means. So I had to kind of come out of these own stories and really see everyone as like a human sibling, because they are. Okay.
To what degree do you think world travel helps break these biases? Because again, keep in mind, Americans, you've went to third world countries, which is 85% of the globe.
That's right.
Falls under a third world country.
That's right.
But when Americans travel, it's usually Rome or Paris
Europe
or Cancun.
Yeah.
To what degree of exposing yourself to other cultures do you think help break these biases?
I think it depends on how you travel. That's the nuance, right? Because if we just go to Cancun to a 5-star resort and you're just hanging out, it can actually fuel those biases because you see locals in like subservient roles and you're not really learning anything about the other culture. But if you're going to different places and you're volunteering with local communities, you learn about the history of that country, you learn about, the culture and the traditions of that country, and you really interact with them. So for me, that's what I did. Like every time I'd go to a new country, when I first started traveling, I'd go to an orphanage. I'd play with the kids there. I'd want to learn about their stories. When I was in South Korea after college, I was on a Fulbright, so also funded by the U.S. We had a homestay family. So I lived with Koreans. Like I had to learn the language. It's not very good right now, but it used to be better. When I was in India, similarly, I lived at the institution, so I had to get to know the Muslim communities I was a part of. And that creates that social contact actually helps us break down these barriers. The unreal other that I learned from education or media was like, oh no, those are like false stories. Like every single one of the people that I'm with is a unique human being, right? But they also are subject to those same forces. So when you talked about, there are a lot of people in Islamic communities that don't like us, right? Because they too are subject to those 5 causes, right? The false stories in media and education in their countries. So part of, our collective work now is to really overcome these stories, and create new narratives of what it means to be human, what it means to be a global, community, in the 21st century with so many other challenges that we have right now with climate change, AI, technology, lack of nuclear proliferation.
You mentioned AI. I guess biases in AI are dependent on the coders.
Exactly.
So right now with AI, which is we could say the advent of AI because we're still in the early stages, and the mass adoption of it. What biases are you referring to within AI that you've studied?
All of them. Like I'll give you an example. So there was an algorithm that was created to study the creditworthiness of people that apply to a particular credit card, and they were 2 executives at a big company. I won't name which company. Husband and wife who applied for that credit card, and the man was given a credit that was 10 times more than the woman when they share their finances, right? Their net worth is the same.
It's the same. Yeah.
So this is how it's being amplified. Then there are challenges on surveillance technology, right? Because the data sets that are being uses a certain type of a human being and certain facial features, it confuses people, right? If you're Aboriginal Australian, it can't even see you and it can misplace you. And if that's used in policing, for example, and as it's already happened, you catch the wrong person and then you ruin lives, you ruin families, you ruin communities. So I think for me, like AI actually is quite exciting in terms of helping us alleviate a lot of the challenges in our society. But we have to really be mindful of the underlying data sets that it's using. Because, one of my professors, John Sender at Cambridge, used to say, garbage in, garbage out. Very simple. Yeah. And one of the challenges with AI is that oftentimes we're making decisions about communities in the global south and third world countries, as you said, who have a different cosmology of being, who use different languages, and AI or any technology is not even in their languages, right? So we're not even able to capture how they think, how they believe, how they relate to themselves and one another. And yet decisions about their lives are being made by a way of being that's foreign to them. And that's what, for me, like, because the vast majority of AI is in English. And then after that, possibly Chinese. And
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
So Chinese and English are the primary.
Yeah. And then European languages and other Asian languages, possibly like Japanese or Korean.
Yes. Yeah.
But again, what is language? Language is based So there's a famous saying, a Buddhist saying that, you use the finger to point to the moon, but the finger is just showing you where the moon is. The finger itself is not the moon, right? It's the same thing with words, that language that we use. We use language to describe like our emotions or our concepts or ideas, but they're not an approximation of that. They're not fully encapturing what we're trying to say, right? So not to get too mystical on you, but that's basically the challenge with AI, because it's very much a 0-1-0-1 thing, right? And it's very much about exactness, and then we lose all nuance. So these are the types of challenges, these ethical challenges that companies have been dealing with, but they have to deal with more and more moving forward.
Going to current events, and not to put you on the spot, if you don't want to tackle this one, I was shocked, or maybe just unaware of the amount of anti-Semitism globally, and we're seeing that the Jewish faith, Zionists have always been persecuted throughout the history. Were you shocked by the amount of anti-Semitism you're seeing?
I'm not. I mean, so one thing I didn't share is that, so I studied abroad in Israel in 2002.
Is there anywhere you haven't studied abroad? Let's just
there
get it off the table.
Many places where I haven't studied, but Israel isn't one of them. I did live
Tel
there.
Aviv or Jerusalem?
I was living in Rehovot, actually, because I was at the Weizmann Institute of Science. I was was between my high school senior year and first year of college. And I also, in high school, I was a tour guide at the Jewish Museum in New York City, a living memorial to the Holocaust. They had a program to actually get non-Jewish students to learn about the Holocaust and give tours to people. So that was actually my first, as a young person, I was 16 at the time, like my first exposure to just what's known as radical evil in the scholarship and the ability of human beings to commit radical evil.
Predominantly studying the Nazi regime.
The Nazi regime and the Shoah, as it's known in the Jewish tradition, or the Holocaust. Of course, of people of Jewish descent in Europe, but also of the Roma people, also known as Gypsies, of LGBTQ people, of communists, of Polish people. Like there was, vast majority of Jewish extermination, but there was extermination of entire other populations, disabled people. So I think for me, that was really helpful to kind of begin to see. And for me, then going back to anti-Semitism, right? A bias toward people of Jewish faith. Same 5 causes. There's a false story about what that means, right? And then it's enacted into policies, and then through social contact, education, and media, we're learning these biases, right? We've globalized these biases in a way. So what's happened in the last couple of years is, unless we get to the root causes of these challenges, they will continue to persist, wherever we go.
You talk about exclusion and inclusion. Would love to get your perspectives on what the meaning of those two words are, and then get into DEI with which has been a very hot topic.
Yeah.
Both successful and unsuccessful. But exclusion and inclusion, which I know are like the Harvard buzzwords now that every corporation is using.
That's great. So basically, for me, I'll give you a quick story. How did I come to write this book? I had no desire to write a book, particularly at this time. I'm very much an introvert, and I just love to study and like to know things.
Usually the best writers. Yeah.
And also, but I am a teacher, right? I'm an educator, and that's kind of where I started my career. So in 2020, I had the honor of meeting and speaking with Oprah, as well as Isabel Wilkerson, around her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. I was a part of the Oprah Conversation. It's a podcast over 8 episodes. And what Isabel has done in her scholarship and her work is that she's kind of diagnosed the problem. And she basically says any human hierarchy, whether it's under the Nazi regime in Germany or the caste system in India or race in America, there are like 5 pillars to how these hierarchies are constructed. And she goes in detail about how that happens across societies in a global sense. And then she has like a, epilogue at the end of her book. So, well, how do we dismantle these caste systems, these hierarchies? And she says radical empathy. That's the solution, right? Short. And for me at that moment, I was like, whoa, this is what I've been doing for 7 years. So I left my profession as a lawyer to start my company, Be More. And what I've been doing is training people in mindfulness-based tools. So we're not in our, fight, flight brain all the time, but really thinking thoughtfully. So a seed was planted that I was like, oh, wow, like this is the way. Like I've been teaching mindfulness and compassion for so long. We need to really amplify this. Height of COVID, like, okay, we'll write a book later. 4 months later, January 6th happened, 2021. And I just had sleepless nights because by that time I trained over 80,000 professionals in some of these tools. But I was like, that's not even a drop in the bucket. I'm training folks in nonprofits and corporations and government, but we need to reach the masses. So that's where the urgency of writing this book really came for me, that I really want more and more people to be aware of how biases are learned and how they can be unlearned. So that's what started the journey through almost 4 years ago now. And as I was researching for the book, I wanted to write a book that wasn't just about one kind of bias. Oftentimes the two kinds of biases that really attract a lot of our attention, and rightly so, is racial bias and gender bias. And I have chapters on those too. But I wanted anyone anywhere in the world to be able to read this book and see themselves reflected in it. So if you're a minority in Japan or in Turkey or Algeria, you're like, oh wow, like this is why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing, and here's how we can change it. So as I was doing that research, I began to see, I had to go back into all of recorded human history. So I don't know if you've read *Sapiens*, the book by Yuval.
I have not, but
yeah, you've heard about it. Yeah. So that's one of the textbooks that was really useful, which I've read like maybe 5 or 6 times, if not more. But for me, I was looking at it from a lens of bias, and also outside of just like the Western model, right? Oftentimes you think about civilizations that are Europe-based, Middle East, even South Asia and China, but the rest of the world, we don't know. Kind of like we'll just shrug our shoulders. So I actually went into a lot of indigenous, history, different types of indigenous and animist cultures across the Americas, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and really began to see, like, well, how did they live? What were their societies like before globalization, before colonization, and other things? And that's where this idea of exclusion and inclusion really began to come, into force for me. So basically, the idea really is that the vast majority of the world, 10,000 years of recorded human history, if you think about it, was actually living in like small tribes.
Yes.
Right? And they didn't know what existed outside of them, but they were kind of spreading ideas as they were moving around. And a lot of these societies are actually very rooted in inclusion, on these ideas of compassion and interdependence and being one with nature. But then there's certain societies that, what I call settled societies, not civilizations, because again, that's like a word that's all about hierarchies. But some settled societies that wanted to really create hierarchies. And these societies spread around the world. If you think about the Roman Empire, right? You think about China and the Eastern. So that's kind of how exclusion consciousness has really began to spread. And for me, a certain way of being of exclusion is really about being the right type of human. And that's been globalized in what's known as modernity. So the last 500 years. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, why is it that there's anti-Semitism in like Black communities or brown communities? Like they have a lot of Jewish people are Black and brown too, but where does that come from? Well, because they adopted a certain interpretation of Christianity that taught them certain things about Jewish people, right? And as a result, that consciousness, right? Those false stories are being spread, and people are feeling separate from one another, and also separate from their own ancestors, right? Oftentimes, when you become something, you have to completely forsake your ancestors. Another place I've lived is Mexico.
Not kidding.
And I was in Mérida, which is not too far in the Yucatan, not too far from Cancun actually. And I had a homestay family. They looked 100% indigenous looking, but they refused to say that they were indigenous. They were like, we're Cristianos, we're Christians, we're not Indios. And to call someone an Indio in Mexico and Latin America is a slur. Yeah. Because it's still perceived as savage, as primitive, right? And that's, again, the label that's been given. That's the very conscious bias there. So those are the types of things we have to begin to really reflect on. Like, where do these words come from? Why do we characterize people that are one with nature as bad or backwards or primitive versus just, oh, these are just ways of being. and they have a right to be that way. And yeah, I don't know if I answered your question on inclusion. Oh, but one other thing I want to add there is that, so as this exclusion consciousness of hierarchy spread with globalization, there's also been a rise of inclusion consciousness. You know, it's always existed, but in the last, I would say 100 years, it's really come into place. First with the League of Nations, at the United Nations, with the Human Rights Charter. Then we've seen just civil rights legislation, not just in the US, but around the world. You know, freedom to be, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, rights for people with disabilities, neurodiversity, you name it. So we're becoming more and more tolerant. And not just tolerant, we're becoming more and more accepting of difference. But now there's a battle. What we're seeing is lots of battles between that right way of being a human versus just being a human in all of its manifestations. And that's where, you know, we're at that inflection point now.
That's a understatement. with DEI,
Yes.
which I'm sure you're a proponent for. We've seen, so DEI really came to the forefront. I'd say during the Obama administration, they really pushed the initiatives, repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which I'm fully in support of, transgenders in the military. But we've seen a lot of corporations in the last year say, hey, this isn't working.
Right.
We're removing it. A lot of universities have revoked the policy.
Yeah.
Funny enough, strangely, the academies, the service academies have not.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been tracking that.
Yeah.
Where do you think it's failed for a lot of these corporations, and where do you think it goes from here?
That's right. Well, it makes sense why the service academies have not repealed them, because it's core to their mission. They have diverse humans that make up these places, and they need these humans to get along with one another. Hence, they need those kinds of programs.
The military's always been a little more progressive in a melting pot compared to mainstream society.
Indeed.
And I was very impressed by the amount of inclusion.
Exactly.
Where, for example, the Marines will tell you they don't see color. They just either see light green or dark green. Yeah. But you're a Marine either way. Right. Always found that phenomenal. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, and that's the kind of attitude we need to bring into the mass conscious, mainstream. So, you know, I started my company. It's a learning and development company, really training people in the 5 tools that break bias. And we kind of fell into the DEI field, largely because that's where the budget line items were. So when folks wanted our programs, it was coming from those DEI departments. But from a very early place, like 2014 is when I started my company, I was a little uncomfortable with it, because it's not that DEI is something we need. And not just DEI, I call it DEIB, thanks to another Texan, Brene Brown, belonging.
Yes.
Because that's really the ultimate goal. But the challenge that I saw with it from a human behavioral perspective, so as someone who studies the brain, who studies human behavior and psychology, what I saw, and also being an educator, what I saw in the way programs were being implemented was that they were rooted in shame. They're rooted in a right way of being and a wrong way of being, right? And when you have shame in a conversation or in a learning module, and I taught middle school in Korea, I know this, your brain shuts down, your body shuts down, you can't learn. And then there's inevitably a conflict. So where DEI training programs have kind of been challenged with is that they've been designed by people that are not looking at human behavior and human nervous system, but it's been really about certain ways of delivering content. And for me, the content that we deliver around DEI, because we need to bridge understanding like at the service academies, but we need to design these curriculum from a place of compassion and empathy. They have to be shame-free, and they must be trauma-informed, because this stuff hurts. It's deeply personal. Like the experiences of bias. I don't care how many privileges one has in the society. You've experienced bias for your height, for your size. Maybe you're too fat or you're too thin or your eyes are blue or green, whatever. People have experienced it and it's painful. So therefore, like, this is where, you know, pedagogy is so important and the way we bring these trainings. And sadly, and I wrote an article in the Business of HR around this. You know, the reason why we're seeing the backlash is because of shame, blame, and guilt. Those were basically what a lot of DEI companies have used to further DEI. But again, it's rooted in exclusion consciousness again, because it's trying to dominate. And therefore it's backfired. With that said, DEI is the future. DEIB is the future, because we are an incredibly diverse group of humans, not just in America, but around the world. And also, as individuals, we're diverse. We have so many different identities, right? So to say that diversity is wrong is just to say, we don't breathe air, or we're not made up of like red blood cells and white blood cells. That's just who we are. The part of what's going to need to happen is to really bridge that polarization. And that's going to require, once again, the tools that are needed to break bias, which is the PRISM toolkit.
That is such a difficult problem set. How do you go about hiring to make sure that you have a diverse force while maintaining the standard that one has to exhibit or demonstrate within their roles and responsibilities? Because then it creates conflict with somebody who says, well, she got hired because she's a woman, or he got hired because he's a black man, but I'm more competent within the roles and responsibilities that he's now tasked with executing.
Right. Well, I think there's several ways, it's really context dependent, right? But there's so many ways, like blind hiring is one, which is really, really successful. They first started this in the music industry, where orchestras would be, they would play whatever instrument they were playing, but they'd be behind a curtain. And then suddenly they had so many more women in orchestras, right? Because people were just listening to the music, so their product versus who the people were.
Because the cognitive biases come in the second you see a woman versus...
Exactly. So there's lots of ways to do that. But one thing that hasn't been done as much, which is really important, I think the reason why we're so challenged as a society and oftentimes are called that we're so elitist, is that a lot of times firms are only hiring at certain universities and in certain regions.
Which is a bias. Yeah.
Huge bias, huge class bias, huge geography bias, huge university bias, right? Alma mater bias, you name it. So as a result, it's really not about the candidates. It's about where the candidates are being given the opportunity to be hired. And oftentimes what's happening in workplaces is folks are hiring people from the universities they went to. They went to Stanford, they went to NYU, they went to Harvard, whatever. And those are the people that
really... He named his university. He was like, I just got to throw it in there. I'm part of the
part of the problem. Absolutely. Thankfully, I've never hired anyone who went to NYU. Not because they didn't apply, but they just weren't the best talent for that role.
Let me throw it, because we dealt with this on both a micro and a macro level within the military, and it's still a conversation. I mean, you got Pete Hegseth, who's stepping in as the SecDef. I don't see why he won't be confirmed by the Senate, but he's a proponent of removing women from combat roles for data-based reasons.
Okay.
But I even remember in the SEAL teams, this was I think it was around 2011 this started, that they said, hey, we need more black SEALs. And then it was a few years after that is we need women in the SEALs. They've done the blind selection, but it was probably by design. No woman has ever passed the blind selection because the criteria that they're up against with their male counterparts, it's based off scores. Women physically aren't going to make that. Mentally,
that's right.
Yeah, with intellect, they're probably on par, but when it comes down to the physical scores, they don't make it.
That's right.
And we never understood, because Africa was a big focus starting around 2008, that if we had more black SEALs, one, they look like, which black Americans don't look like a lot of Africans, that they would be able to build relationships. And I understand that argument, but it wasn't attainable. Yeah. And it's died on the vine. But I mean, the military, there's going to be a lot of argument coming in the next 4 years. They're most likely going to remove the transgenders. And again, a lot of the reasons are data-based, because, if you look at the policy, they're going through surgeries, they're never deployable, then they're not really executing their roles in the military.
Sure.
Are there certain, I guess where I'm going with this, are there certain professions or industries where diversity just doesn't make sense, in your opinion?
So it depends on the type of diversity, right? So for Navy SEALs, there is a gender difference, right? There's a biological difference there. And I'm sure at some point a woman will be able to, be on par. They just haven't gotten there yet, right? So there's definitely a challenge around, gender diversity. But with racial and ethnic diversity, I'm going to be more curious about the process of how it's done. And there might be some unconscious or possibly conscious biases there if they're not being able to get to ethnic and racial diversity. Largely because when you look at the research and when I study the made-up nature of race. So race is a very recent phenomenon. It was developed less than 300 years ago, and our global consciousness has been infected with this idea. And it was created by a bunch of dudes who love to collect skulls of human beings and fabricated this idea of white, black, Asian, Latina, Native American, whatever, literally made it up and superimposed their own subjective poison onto these groups of people. And these are the stereotypes that continue to percolate in the collective consciousness to this day. If you think about, let's say 500 years ago, 1524, and I asked you, how many people existed in 1524 to make the single human that you are today? Take a guess.
The nature of the amount of time.
Yeah.
I would say 0, but I know I'm probably wrong. You're going to school me here.
Yeah, I know. Definitely, there were, like, you have 2 parents, you have 4 grandparents, you have biologically many, many people, right? There were 15 million people in 1524, 500 years ago, that are responsible for the one human you are today. You have the DNA of 15 million human beings inside of you. Same for me, same for Will, same for everyone else out there. Biologically. And the interesting thing there is, phenotypically, what we call race, right? We really base it off of like the last couple of generations. So we come out a certain way. But at the DNA level, we're all mixed. All you needed was one ancestor who was Native or Middle Eastern or South Asian, and that whole line of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people becomes from that region. So that's why, inclusion consciousness, the idea is really Buddhist idea, inner being from Thich Nhat Hanh. We're so interdependent and we're so connected. So that's where the race and ethnicity stuff is challenging to me. And again, it's rooted in a lot of false science.
Have you taken 24andMe?
I have not, because it's problematic for that reason.
I don't want my DNA on register, but my dad took it.
And that too.
The results are, it will strike up a conversation because it was Asia, it was Africa, it was
everywhere,
the European countries, but it was South America.
Yeah.
And it just made no sense to us, how we could have that.
Well, I'll comment here because it's become a really big fad, and and they have in fine print, they say this is only for entertainment purposes and it's not 100% accurate. So the way they do that is they've collected alleles of certain populations of certain places around the world, and then they have again marked them as Turkish, as Kosovar, as West African. But these identities oftentimes didn't exist in the past, right? And also those data banks are not representative of who we are as humans. There were so many types of people that no longer exist, or they've changed their cultures because of, various incursions. So part of it is it's really because there is a nostalgic feeling that we have as human beings.
Our identity.
But ultimately, it's just a story that we've created.
Yeah.
But we literally are interbeing, inter-are.
You wrote this book to reach a mass scale.
Yeah.
And you'll probably take a sliver off of the larger problem set of breaking bias. Mm-hmm. You're not going to achieve it during your lifetime. You can start pushing people in that direction.
Yeah.
What do you hope to achieve not only from this book or beyond this? And what are your plans over the years to start this this sort of movement? Are you working with government? I'm assuming you have to.
Yeah.
At a grander scale.
Sure.
Media.
Sure.
What are the plans here?
Yeah, those are literally my plans, right? For me, the last 4 years were really about writing this book and writing it in a way that...
4 years?
Yeah, 2020. Remember, it's 2024 now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been writing this for a long time. And of course, it's 20 years of my research, since I started with this idea of bias and breaking bias. And
how many manuscripts?
3.
3 main manuscripts.
Yeah.
So you got pretty damn close on the first manuscript.
Yeah. But, had to do it over and over again. And basically, my first manuscript didn't have gender. I wrote a book because I was so overwhelmed with the idea of gender. because it's so vast and there's so many different cultures, and gender bias is different in China versus in the US versus in France. But then I had to do it. So this is where I like dug deep, went on retreats, woke up at 4 a.m, read a lot of literature, and I was like, no, this is one of the biggest challenges we face as a as a species, right? Gender bias. And so I had to do it. So I did it.
Does the book also go into that there are genders beyond male and female?
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's what I had to learn also. This is where the indigenous literature was so helpful, because one of the people I interviewed is
As far back as, what are we talking?
Oh, as far back as 1,000 years, 1,500, 2,000 years, 10,000 years. And I spoke to an indigenous woman from Native Alaska, right? So she basically told me that, colonization came to them pretty late, like Western contact. So a lot of them still remember their ancestral ways, because it's only been 150, 120 years since they came into contact with Christianity in particular and binary gender. But they've had more than 2 genders in their culture for as long as they can remember. They call them two-spirit people in English, but it's actually like people that are born male but present female.
Spirit.
Yeah, so it's like their spirit, right? And they always had particular specific functions in society. They were always venerated, and they were oftentimes the shamans, the healers, the artists, but they played a certain role. But what happened, and again, this is why it's so important to study our policies, in the United States and also in Canada, they implemented the Code of Religious Offenses against people who were two-spirit. So we would call them like LGBTQ today, but these were people who were born male, but they presented as female and
persecuted.
They were persecuted. They were killed oftentimes. They were sent to mental asylum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for me, like understanding that was really important because, and this wasn't just in the Americas. This was also in Europe. This was also in Africa. This was in Asia. But again, this is the exclusion consciousness that tries to really drive down a single way of being onto the human spirit. But the human spirit is just so diverse. It's going to continue to evolve. We're going to continue to change, and whether we like it or not, right? So, yeah, I think that. And so to go to your question, what's my hope? My hope is really to share this work as much as possible, right? So, of course, I've been on a speaking tour for a while, continue to talk about this. But my hope is to go to every single state and really invite people into this conversation. Yeah. I wrote this book at the 9th grade level for a reason, because I'd like high school students to learn this as early as possible and also overcome the biases they have about themselves, the way they feel less than because of false stories. There's a huge intersection between breaking bias and mental health. And I think for me right now, one of the challenges we face as a country, as a world, is loneliness, social isolation, right?
COVID did not help the situation whatsoever.
Exactly. It came, at the worst time possible, right? And of course, for young people, that's one of the biggest challenges, media addiction. So I think these tools that I've presented in the book are really going to help people. My hope is to come out of that. And then hopefully we can introduce this in the government. It's agnostic to politics because it's really for everyone. So we feel better about ourselves and with one another, and we can begin to trust one another to really tackle the challenges we actually have.
I want to go back because you said something with tribal cultures in what you studied.
Yeah.
And given the trends of, let's just focus on the United States and the fact that communities are not as prevalent as they were when I grew up in the late 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
Does that fuel biases? Because again, one, people have no identity to a tribe or a community, and their source of information is straight out of polarized media. Is that feeding into the biases?
I think so, for sure. It's because, we've kind of lost our connection to our ancestors and our ancestral ways of being, and oftentimes what's happened as a result, I talk about this in the book quite a bit, is that we've become super disembodied.
You said disembodied.
Yeah.
How so?
And disconnected. We're just in our heads all the time, There's this false idea, this false Cartesian idea that I think, therefore I am.
Is this?
No. We are so much more than what we think, right? There's a whole universe, neck below that exists. And there's so much research out there with respect to our gut brain, our hearts, and our, the somatic experience of, trauma that we have to really begin to invite into this conversation. So I think,
let me ask you this: that internalized trauma that you're talking about, and the fact that people are so focused inward, is that worse than, let's say, 30, 40, 100 years ago?
Yeah, it's much worse. Much,
you
much
think
worse.
that is fueling the mental health?
Yeah.
Is that almost like comparison is the thief of joy? Do you think comparison has become the new sort of baseline of, well, I'm comparing myself to that person, and so I'm less than?
Yeah. It's basically the advent of advertising, right? In the 1950s, it's ubiquitous. And the way if you think about what advertising is, it's to make you feel a certain way, insufficient, inadequate, missing something, therefore you'll go buy something, whether it's an experience or a product or a service, whatever it may be, right? But we're constantly bombarded with all these stories about how we're inadequate, right? And media has a huge role to play. There's a kind of I would say like an enlightened being who lived, a Swiss American who lived in the US. And he gave this lecture that I quote in the book where he says that, the challenge, this was in the 1980s, the challenge that we faced in the 20th century was the introduction of TV. It was bad enough with radio, but with TV, it got specifically worse because what TV was doing was sending a lot of negative vibrations to the people, right? A lot of hate and triggering things, right? The news media. And what he said is prior to the advent of this technology, the home used to be a fortress. So you went outside the home, you fought your battles, whether it was at work or wherever. But you'd come home and you just feel relieved, you felt protected. But what media has done is that it's pierced the home. And now with social media, it's not only just pierced the home with a TV, it's now in our bathrooms.
It's anywhere you want to be.
And anywhere you want to be, right? It's with glasses, that'll come in. Your consciousness is being pierced by external stimulation. And that's what's fueling the mental health crisis. So like when I have worked in like indigenous communities and communities that don't have media, their ways of being is very different and the way they feel is very different. I talked about contentment, right?
Homecoming, belonging, vulnerability, and in a sense of they contribute to the community.
Exactly.
It's almost, this is probably, I'm going off of my train of thought. I'm almost becoming more insular because of media and social media, and it's almost a mantra of like, to hell with everyone, just focus on my family, and but it's also killing dialogue and the ability to have constructive conversations, even though we agree to disagree on certain things. Exactly. It seems like that discourse is dying in sense that there's just no hope for communities to be rebuilt. That's my sense right now, and that's a very negative, pessimistic view.
Well, I think this is what we have to do. This is the work of the century for me. We have to bridge the polarization. We have to address loneliness. We have to tackle misinformation and disinformation. And this is why when I go through the history, the methods and the platforms we're using today are different, but it was very similar 100 years ago. So like propaganda under communists in China or Soviet Union or the Nazi regime worked the same way. It was false stories that were triggering people with, right? They had paintings or posters or radio. Now we have all these other ways, but it's the same way that our human body is, interacting with this information. So for me, it's like the way we hack this system is, I talk about 5 tools in the book, PRISM. PRISM is an acronym for those tools, and it starts with M and goes up to P. But mindfulness is the bedrock of PRISM. And we become mindful of what's happening. Mindful of not just our thoughts and the thoughts that arise, really become aware of them, but also the body sensations, the emotions, the concepts. And that's a skill. And I know that Navy SEALs work a lot with mental agility. But that's the tool that we can really bring to the masses.
That's a bias, dude. You just threw out a bias. What the hell? Some are.
No, you're being too humble.
I appreciate the fact that you've dived into this and you've made this your life work. Especially, I've got 2 kids, 20-year-old and a 16-year-old. 20-year-old is a daughter. 16-year-old, my son, and I just have a 6-week-old, which you just met. If you guys don't know, my podcast studio is now out of my house, so Jordan answers the door. But, it is one of the things is I do want to teach her, and it's almost the Martin Luther King quote, judge a person for his character or her character, not the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or who they love or who they worship.
Right.
And I don't know where we've gone wrong with that. And when people paint with these broad brushstrokes of all Indians are this way,
Yeah.
all Africans are this way, all Russians are communists,
Right.
it kills me. It takes one, and I think it was the Dalai Lama said, be the spark that lights 1,000 candles, man.
Yeah.
And that's what you're doing. And I applaud you for it. I know corporations can find you at Anu Gupta NY.com. Was Anu Gupta already taken?
Yeah.
It was. Okay, so yeah, NY. Just think Anu Gupta New York NY.com. What about schools? Are you trying to reach out to schools and governmental organizations?
Yeah, so I've spoken at a bunch of schools, so high schools, universities, colleges, grad schools. I feel like every law student needs to read this book. Every divinity school student needs to read this book. So I talk a lot about modern neuroscience, but also how what we're discovering with brain scans and social psychology and neuroscience is what a lot of wisdom keepers of the past were saying, whether they were Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or Hindu, you name it, indigenous, but they just had different ways of formulating what we're finding. So it's really exciting, I feel, that this is actually science and spirituality aren't opposites. They could actually work hand in hand. And you quoted Dr. King. He is one of my inspirations. And, I start the book with a quote by him, which is, our goal is to build a beloved community. And this will require qualitative changes in our souls and quantitative changes in our lives. So for me, breaking bias is really making those qualitative and quantitative changes. And it happens moment by moment, and the end goal is that, beloved community.
One step at a time.
One step at a time.
And it's the exponential effect, because one person can go on to affect 3, 5 more, and those people can go on to do the same. I'm with you. A lot of people are with you. I think given the state of where this country is, it's just it's okay to feel pessimistic.
Absolutely.
That change can come, but we are going to have to, in the words of your book, break through that, and that's going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's going to be divisive.
Yeah.
But it's called conflict resolution for a reason.
Exactly.
So again, for anyone, go pick up the book. I always say go to Amazon. That's probably the best source. It's been out since September 17th. Let me ask you this. Speaking at high schools and colleges, I'm sure you've had some kids in tears come up after your speech. Where have you found the most impact? High school, at a younger age, or college? Or both?
Both, probably. I think because it hits different students differently. But I think what speaks to most, young people is really the mindfulness component. One of the tools that I teach, pro-social behaviors, these are basically a host of techniques that are rooted in positive mental and emotional states of being, so empathy and compassion. And I teach them how to do that in the book as well, starting with self-compassion, loving kindness towards self. And that's where I begin to see that, wow, like this is so transformative, because kids haven't been taught that, And so I think for me, that's what the hope is. And I do feel like young people are going to be doing this, work even beyond you and I.
Yeah. Well, the next generation is always the best generation if we pour into them, if we invest in them to be just quite frankly better than we are.
Yes, indeed.
Well, dude, congrats on the book.
Thank you.
4
so
years
much.
in the making. That's amazing. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
We'll take a picture after this, but guys, Breaking Bias, go pick it up. And Anu, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. What an honor.
And that's it, guys. This has been another episode of The Everyday Warrior. We'll see you next time.